Mr. Speaker, the greatest security threat in the world today is that of a nuclear-armed Iran. And now Iran is once again the news of the moment, as talks between the United States and Iran have begun. American leaders given the charge to protect America's national security must not be charmed by wolves in sheep's clothing. When innocent Syrian civilians were mercilessly attacked by chemical weapons, the Obama administration was caught on its heels in a foreign policy quandary. America was reminded again that the United States must always be vigilant and embrace an international relations framework which enables proactive engagement rather than merely reactionary crisis response. Mr. Speaker, I definitely think these discussions will proceed in the context of the grave reality the human family will face if nuclear weapons fall into the hands of jihadists in Iran. To use the slightly altered words of our Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, quote, "In a world of terrorists and extremists, we ignore these risks at our peril. We simply cannot afford to have nuclear weapons become the IED or car bomb of tomorrow. Neither our country nor our conscience can bear the costs of inaction." Mr. Speaker, the U.S.-Iran Nuclear Negotiations Act is, quote, "an action that will reinforce the prohibition against nuclear weapons development. We're talking about actions that will degrade Iran's capacity to use these weapons and ensure that they do not proliferate. With this authorization, the President will simply have the power to make sure the United States of America means what we say," unquote. Now, Mr. Speaker, actually, the words I've just quoted were really just the essential words of Secretary Kerry's recent justification for wanting to attack Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. However, I changed that quote a little bit, Mr. Speaker. Whenever he said Syria, I inserted Iran. And whenever he said chemical weapons, I inserted nuclear weapons, Mr. Speaker. And if this line of the reasoning of the administration if they choose to stand behind this, then we simply cannot refute the parallel argument related to a nuclear Iran, which poses an exponentially greater threat in terms of our security to the United States of America. Secretary Kerry asserted that Mr. Obama, quote, "means what he says." But, Mr. Speaker, if the world truly believed that this president means what he says, the chemical weapons crisis in Syria would never have occurred in the first place. Secretary Kerry said of the Syrian crisis that North Korea and Iran were closely watching our actions. However, Mr. Speaker, the converse is actually far more accurate. Syria has been closely watching Mr. Obama's inaction toward North Korea and Iran since he became president. And consequently, Assad felt he could use chemical weapons on innocent men, women, and children with impunity. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the entire world now sees the U.S. under this president as all talk. However, in this monumentally important issue of preventing Iran from gaining nuclear weapons, our critical diplomatic policies must be backed by our immovable will to back them up by all means necessary. The popular narrative of the Obama administration is to embrace Iran's openness and rewarded their willingness to negotiate, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, we know United Nations resolutions, IAEA declarations, and diplomatic efforts, including 10 rounds of negotiations toward this regime, have borne absolutely no fruit at all. Decades have passed without a single concession from this, the world's leading sponsor of terror. In 2005, we saw North Korea, another rogue nation, petition for, quote, talks about ending their nuclear weapons program and demanding U.S. concessions. How did they hold up their end of that bargain? They conducted 3 flagrant nuclear weapons tests. This in spite of the fact that North Korea has been sanctioned, in terms of economic sanctions, into the virtual starvation of their people for now a half-century. Mr. Speaker, Iran is closer than ever before and racing toward nuclear weapons capability. The Iranian government's intentions, actions, and capacity to develop nuclear weapons capability and sponsor international terrorism are terrifyingly clear. The time to regain our credibility with both our allies and foes alike in this region is now, before the situation devolves into a Syria-like situation, frantically searching for solutions after the crisis has already begun. To that end, Mr. Speaker, I have introduced the U.S.-Iran Nuclear Negotiations Act, and I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor this bill, along with 25 other members of Congress who are now signed on. The U.S.-Iran Nuclear Negotiations Act will strengthen the United States negotiating position in the upcoming talks with Iran, and it will outline vital congressional priorities on any nuclear negotiations with Iran. Mr. Speaker, a bad deal with Iran, which does not definitively prevent weapons-capable Iran, is worse than no deal at all. And I'm afraid that's exactly where this administration may take us. And, Mr. Speaker, we must not let it happen. Whatever the cost is to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran, it will pale in insignificance compared to the cost to our children and the entire human family of allowing the jihadist regime in Iran to gain nuclear weapons.